Hey everyone, this is Gary, and last movie we looked at the develop module, specifically the tools up here underneath the histogram. I want to spend some time on the basic section, which you can twirl up and down to reveal the basic options, and there's a lot of them. And the bottom line for the basic section is you're going to be spending 80 to 90% of your development time in this area right here. There are so many options that are great. So let's get right to it. So here I have this image. This is straight out of camera. It's a raw image. If I hit the I key, I can get rid of that heads-up display. So this image is pretty good, you know, but we can make it better. So first of all, I want to show you the highlights slider. Now, check out the sky. It's relatively dramatic, but if I lower the highlights, basically what I'm doing, look at the difference, right? See how much more drama I'm getting in the sky? Because basically I'm just dimming down. If you look at the histogram, you can see I'm dimming down the brightest areas of this image, which in this case makes the contrast in the clouds a lot brighter. Also, the whites slider, if I pull that down, I get even a little more drama, something like that. So highlights can increase the brightest areas of the photograph or decrease the brightest areas of the photograph. In this case, decreasing the brightest areas really helps. Now I'm going to give the image a little more contrast, which also helps. See the difference? Look at the histogram. Notice how it's spreading out, left and right. We're darkening the darker areas and brightening the brighter areas. Kind of, in a way, doing the opposite of what we did with the highlights, which was to dim down the brightest areas. But this is an overall contrast effect. So the bottom line with contrast is it will brighten. Look at the histogram. You can see how I'm really spreading out those areas across the board. It's a very kind of like a global adjustment. Whereas if we come down here to clarity, now let me set the contrast back to 0. If I go to clarity, look what happens to the histogram. You see the difference? Here's clarity. Here's contrast. Keep your eye on the histogram. Clarity increases the contrast of the midtones. Only the midtone areas. So if I nail the clarity slider all the way to the right, basically my midtones have been spread out, but my dark shadows and my bright highlights have barely been touched. Whereas with contrast, everything gets either darker or lighter. So clarity is just increasing or decreasing the midtone contrast, just for the midtones. All right, so increasing clarity really helps this image. Clarity plus contrast gives us a lot more leeway in terms of contrast. Lowering the highlights gives us more drama in the sky, as well as clarity giving us more drama in the sky. And then if I increase the vibrance, I get more color. See, we get more color down here. Now, I've skipped white balance. I'm going to change the white balance. I want the sky to go a little more blue. And then I want to pull out some magentas, just a touch of magentas. So I cooled down the image just a touch. That's probably a little too much. I increased the magentas by moving the tint slider to the right. And that looks like a little more dramatic sunset. Here's where we are. Here's before, here's after. Huge difference, right? And then I'm going to come up here to my crop adjustment tool and go angle. And what I want to do is draw a line straight across this horizon because it was a little bit crooked. All right, if I hit done. Okay, so you see, you could do a lot to an image in the basic module. All right, so let's move on to another image. Here's an image. It's relatively dull, okay? If I come up to the histogram and activate this button here, this is called, let me hover over it. I forget what it's actually called. Well, it's basically, it's telling me what part of my image is clipped, okay? So if I hold down my Alt key and I move my exposure slider to the right, it's telling any image, any pixel that isn't black is clipped, okay? So if I move my exposure slider to the right, you can see that I'm clipping more and more, obviously. If I move it to the left, and I move it far enough to the left, none of my highlights get clipped, all right? So that comes into play with highlights. If I move my highlight slider just a little bit to the left, all those white pixels disappear. Basically, I've just darkened down all those pixels that were clipped. So that helps. Same thing for my shadows. If I click on this button, this gives me my clipped shadows, which basically there are none. If I hold down my Alt key and move my shadows, I don't actually get anything. But if I hold down my Alt key and move my black point, and I just start to see some pixels and then let go, so, you know, now I've moved my black point, so I've darkened the image, the shadows of my image, and here's the difference, before, after, right? There's more clarity to it. And then if I take my white point by holding down the Shift key and my whites, and I move that a little bit to the right, now I've set my white point. If I let go of my Alt key, there we go. So now I've set my white point and my black point. And if I take my clarity slider and I move it a little bit, and then I can basically bump up my exposure just a touch and my vibrance just a touch. Okay, so I feel that this image is a little cool, so I'm going to take my white balance temperature and move it to the right just a touch. There we go. So if I turn off my clip shadow button and my clip highlights button, here's before, here's after. Much improved image, right? Just by making a few slight adjustments here in the basic module. Okay, so let's go to another image. And I want the deer to stand out a little more. I think the background is too bright. So we can fix that, actually. I'm going to lower the overall exposure. I'm going to darken everything. Okay, and if you look at my histogram, you can see it's mostly weighted toward the shadow areas, reflecting what we just did. If I go back to before, that was a histogram before. Midtones and mostly shadows, and I'm going to darken it by about half a stop. Maybe a full stop. Minus 0.1. Okay, one full stop. All right, good enough. I may change that later. That's the beauty of all this. It's all non-destructive. I'm going to grab an adjustment brush, and I'm going to make the exposure about one stop-ish, and I'm going to zoom in. Whoops. I'm going to zoom in. Maybe a zoom in a little more. One like this. 1:1. And I'm going to paint. I'm going to make my brush bigger. So I'm going to paint one stop of exposure onto the deer. And I'm not being very accurate. I realize that. I've got a relatively large brush and it's got a feathered edge. So if I make my brush smaller, I can come down here and get the deer's legs. Okay. And again, I'm not being really accurate. Let me make my brush a little smaller. Get the ears. Top of the head. And some of the, edges, like the chest. Like that. All right, so I went over a little bit. I'm going to really increase the exposure just for now because I want to make sure, number one, that I've got everything. Okay. And again, I know I just said this about 5 times already, but I'm not being really accurate. And that's okay, because I can fix all this. All right, pretty good. Now I'm going to switch the mode to erase right here below. And now I'm going to erase around the edges with a feathered edge. So I'll feather it in. You know, it doesn't have to be a really hard edge. So, okay, just grabbing all the areas that I went over around the, you know, perimeter of the deer. Okay. Make my brush really small by hitting the left bracket key and coming in here. Just like that. Okay. Okay. And now I'll go back to brush A and sort of fix those little tiny areas where I went too far. All right, I mean, obviously the exposure of this brush is way too much, so I'm going to lower it back down to about 1 stop, maybe one and a half stops. And I'm going to change the white balance of just the deer. This is really new in Lightroom 4. This is so cool. So let me go back to fit. All right, so here was before. Here's after. Now, being able to change the white balance selectively with an adjustment brush is really cool. So I was able to change the white balance of the deer, giving him or her a little more warmth, and now it looks more realistic to me. So once again, before, after, before, after. So yeah, I mean, you can see that the combination of the adjustment tools up here, your gradient tool and the adjustment brush, plus all the, well, let me hit done because I'm done with the adjustment brush. By the way, every adjustment brush you use will be marked with what looks like a push pin. So if I deactivate, go done, and then grab another adjustment brush by clicking up here. If I hover into the image, you can see this white thing. This is what's called a push pin. This is basically, if I hover over it, it gives me a mask, a rubelith mask. This tells me what areas of the photograph I use this adjustment brush on. Every single adjustment brush I use, because you can use more than one, will have its own push pin. I'm not going to use another adjustment brush. One last final touch to this photograph, by the way. I'm going to go all the way down here to effects, and I'm going to go post-crop vignetting. Okay, so I'm going to give it a vignette. That's way too much, but I want to show you what it looks like. I'll back off. So I'm going to do something right about there. Okay, so just give it a little subtle vignette to sort of focus the eye on the deer. So here is before, here's after. Before, after. All right, so I think the deer is still a little too bright, so I'm going to select the adjustment brush, activate it by clicking on that push pin, and I'm going to lower the exposure of the deer, just the deer, to something like that. All right, before, after. Okay, that's pretty good. Now I'm going to hit done and brighten my overall exposure. All right, before, after. Very good, right? So that's pretty cool. Okay, so hopefully this little video will introduce you to the power of the basic area and the develop module. I love Lightroom, and I can't tell you how much I love working in Lightroom on images. So hopefully you found this useful. See you next time.